On the evening of June 3rd, 1952, at precisely 8:47 p.m., a white television host named Gerald Maxwell sat behind his mahogany desk at WNYT studio in Midtown Manhattan and made the worst decision of his professional life. He decided to use his platform, a late-night variety show called The Maxwell Hour that reached approximately 340,000 viewers across the New York metropolitan area, to publicly mock Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. The broadcast segment lasted exactly 7 minutes and 23 seconds. It was supposed to be comedy, satirical commentary on the colorful characters of Harlem's underworld. Maxwell, who was 46 years old, had built his career on sharp-tongued observations about New York politics and culture. His show was ranked third in its time slot, pulling decent advertising revenue and maintaining a loyal audience of predominantly white, middle-class viewers who enjoyed his blend of sophistication and controversy. That night, Maxwell performed what he called a dramatic interpretation of recent newspaper stories about organized crime in Harlem. Wearing blackface makeup. Yes, in 1952, this was still considered acceptable entertainment on some television programs. He adopted an exaggerated dialect and portrayed Bumpy Johnson as a buffoonish criminal, incompetent and cowardly, successful only because the real mob bosses allowed him to operate. The studio audience of approximately 120 people laughed. Not uncomfortable laughter, but genuine amusement. The cameras captured their reactions. White faces, well-dressed, enjoying the performance without apparent moral conflict. Maxwell's closing line, delivered with a theatrical flourish, was, "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you run Harlem when you're too ignorant to run anything else." The broadcast ended at 8:54 p.m. By 9:15 p.m., 3 phone calls had been made from Harlem to various locations across Manhattan. By 9:45 p.m., a meeting had been convened at a social club on 147th Street. By 11:30 p.m., decisions had been made that would systematically dismantle Gerald Maxwell's career, reputation, and financial security without a single act of physical violence, without a single threat that could be traced back to its source, without anything that resembled traditional mob retaliation. Because Bumpy Johnson, at 57 years old, had learned something that younger criminals never understood. In 1952 America, with television becoming the dominant cultural force and public image maturing more than ever before, there were ways to destroy someone that were far more devastating than bullets. What happened over the next 7 days would become a masterclass in strategic reputation destruction, demonstrating how power could be exercised through information, social pressure, and the careful manipulation of systems that white America assumed were immune to black influence. Gerald Maxwell woke up on June 4th, 1952, feeling satisfied with his performance. He'd gotten laughs, his producers were pleased, and the segment would probably generate some controversy. Controversy being good for ratings. He had no idea that by June 10th, he would be unemployed, blacklisted from the television industry, and facing financial ruin so complete that he'd be forced to leave New York entirely. And he had absolutely no idea how it would happen, because the methods Bumpy Johnson employed to destroy him existed in spaces Maxwell didn't even know existed. Spaces where black porters talked to white executives, where entertainers shared information across racial lines, where money moved in ways that never appeared in official records, where favors accumulated over decades could be called in simultaneously to devastating effect. The question wasn't whether Gerald Maxwell would pay for those 7 minutes. The question was whether anyone watching what happened to him would understand the message being sent, the demonstration of power being offered, the warning being issued about what happened when you publicly humiliated a man who'd spent 33 years building influence in places you couldn't see. 7 minutes of television. 7 days of systematic destruction. And a lesson that would echo through the entertainment industry for the next 2 decades about who really had power in New York and what happened when you forgot it. To understand how Bumpy Johnson destroyed Gerald Maxwell's career in 7 days without violence, without obvious threats, without anything that could be traced back to him directly. You need to understand what Bumpy had been building since the late 1930s. Not just criminal enterprises, but a network of influence that extended far beyond Harlem's borders into spaces most people assumed Black power couldn't reach. By 1952, Bumpy Johnson controlled approximately 37 policy banks across Harlem, employed over 200 people in various capacities, and generated an estimated annual revenue of $2.8 million. But the policy operations were just the visible structure. Underneath, invisible to casual observers, was something more sophisticated, a web of relationships, obligations, and strategic positioning that touched almost every significant industry in New York. Start with the entertainment industry. In 1952, Black performers were everywhere in New York: jazz clubs, Broadway shows, recording studios, television variety programs. But they existed in a paradoxical space. Visible on stage, invisible in power. They couldn't stay in the hotels where they performed. Couldn't eat in the restaurants where white patrons dined after watching them. Couldn't join the unions that controlled access to the best-paying gigs. Bumpy had been quietly solving these problems since the mid-1940s. When Ella Fitzgerald needed a loan to cover her mother's medical expenses in 1946, Bumpy provided it, at zero interest, with flexible repayment terms. When Billie Holiday was arrested on drug charges in 1947 and needed bail money, Bumpy's lawyers appeared within hours. When Duke Ellington wanted to invest in a Harlem nightclub but couldn't get legitimate financing, Bumpy became a silent partner, providing capital without demanding public credit. By 1952, Bumpy had provided financial assistance, legal help, or crucial intervention for approximately 43 Black entertainers, musicians, and performers. None of these transactions appeared in newspapers. None involved contracts that would hold up in court. But they created something more valuable than legal obligations. They created loyalty, gratitude, and a willingness to help when Bumpy needed something. Then there were the unions. The stagehands union, the electricians union, the musicians union, all controlled by white leadership but dependent on Black workers for crucial labor. Bumpy had been cultivating relationships with Black union members since 1939, providing loans during strikes, mediating disputes, offering protection from management retaliation. By 1952, he had connections to shop stewards, foremen, and union representatives across multiple industries. The hotels presented another opportunity. In 1952, most Manhattan hotels employed Black porters, elevator operators, doormen, and cleaning staff, people who were invisible to white guests but who saw and heard everything. Bumpy had been systematically building relationships with these workers for over a decade. Small loans when rent came due, help finding housing when families faced eviction, legal assistance when employers tried to fire someone unjustly. A porter at the Waldorf Astoria named James Russell later told an interviewer, "Bumpy never asked for anything when he helped you. Didn't make you feel like you owed him, but you remembered. And when he did need something, information, usually just information, you gave it gladly because he'd been there when nobody else was." Then the advertising agencies. By 1952, Madison Avenue was beginning to recognize that Black consumers represented a significant market segment. A few progressive agencies were hiring Black employees, usually in junior positions, usually underpaid, usually facing discrimination that made advancement nearly impossible. Bumpy had been quietly connecting with these employees, providing capital for business ventures, introductions to potential clients, and the kind of respect they didn't receive from their white employers. Finally, there was the political infrastructure. Bumpy had been cultivating relationships with Harlem's political leadership since the 1930s. Not the elected officials who were constrained by public scrutiny, but the ward bosses, committee members, and community organizers who actually controlled votes. By 1952, he had influence over an estimated 18 political operatives who could, when necessary, mobilize constituents, generate pressure, or deliver information to the right people at the right time. None of this was visible to someone like Gerald Maxwell. When he looked at Bumpy Johnson, he saw a black criminal operating in Harlem, constrained by racism and limited to a small geographic territory. He didn't see the invisible architecture, the network of favors, obligations, relationships, and strategic positioning that extended across industries, neighborhoods, and power structures. But that architecture existed. It had been built deliberately, patiently, over 33 years. And when Gerald Maxwell broadcast 7 minutes of racist mockery to 340,000 viewers, Bumpy Johnson activated that entire network simultaneously in a coordinated campaign of professional destruction that would demonstrate exactly how much power could be exercised from the shadows. The meeting at the Social Club on 147th Street, convened at 11:30 p.m. on June 3rd, included 8 people. Not the usual suspects, not policy operators or street-level enforcers, but Bumpy's strategic counsel, a jazz musician who'd worked on 3 major television variety shows, a union representative from the Stagehands Union, a porter who worked at a hotel where advertising executives regularly stayed, a political operative with connections to the New York State Assembly, a lawyer who handled entertainment contracts, an accountant who'd worked for 2 major studios, a journalist from the Amsterdam News, and Stephanie St. Clair, who'd been Bumpy's mentor and partner for over 20 years. They watched a recording of Maxwell's broadcast. Someone had arranged to have it filmed, a detail that would become significant later, and then they planned. Not revenge in the traditional sense, something more sophisticated, something that would use the systems white America had built to protect itself and turn those systems against Gerald Maxwell with such precision that he'd never understand what had really happened. Over the next 7 days, each member of that council would execute specific tasks, activating specific relationships, applying specific pressure to specific points in the architecture that supported Maxwell's career. And they'd do it so quietly, so carefully, that nobody would ever connect the dots back to a television broadcast that had seemed like harmless entertainment. But before those 7 days began, Bumpy made one phone call to someone nobody in that room knew about, someone whose existence in Bumpy's network would shock anyone who knew both men's public identities. The call was answered on the 3rd ring. Bumpy said 6 words. "Did you see the broadcast tonight?" The voice on the other end, white, educated, powerful, responded, "I did. What do you need?" And with that conversation, Gerald Maxwell's fate was sealed. At 9:17 a.m. on June 4th, 1952, Gerald Maxwell arrived at WNYT's studio in Midtown Manhattan for his regular production meeting. He was in good spirits. The previous night's broadcast had generated 17 phone calls to the station, 12 complaining about the blackface segment, 5 praising it. In television terms, that was engagement. Controversy meant people were watching, talking, caring. His producer, a man named Robert Chun, who'd been with the show since its inception in 1949, greeted Maxwell with unusual formality. "We need to talk." Privately, they went to Chin's office, a small room overlooking 47th Street. Chin closed the door and handed Maxwell a folder containing 3 letters. The first was from a National Association of Colored People, signed by Thurgood Marshall himself, condemning the broadcast in language that was measured but devastating. It didn't threaten legal action. That would come later, if necessary, but it promised to mobilize NAACP chapters across the country to pressure advertisers who sponsored Maxwell's program. The second letter was from the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, the union that represented on-air talent. It announced an investigation into whether Maxwell's broadcast violated recently adopted ethical guidelines about racial representation. The investigation would take approximately 6 weeks, during which time AFTRA's leadership would strongly encourage the network to consider whether Maxwell's continued employment aligned with the union's evolving standards. The third letter was from 3 of Maxwell's 5 major advertisers: Colgate-Palmolive, General Foods, and Chevrolet. Each letter used slightly different language, but the message was identical. Unless the network took appropriate remedial action, they would be withdrawing their advertising from the Maxwell Hour effective immediately. Maxwell read the letters twice, his good mood evaporating. This is an overreaction. It was satire. Comedy. We've done controversial segments before. Not like this, Shin said quietly. This is coordinated. 3 letters, arriving within hours of each other, from organizations that don't usually communicate. Somebody organized this. Who? Shin shrugged. Does it matter? What matters is that we're losing advertising revenue and facing union pressure. The network executives are meeting right now to discuss options. What neither Maxwell nor Chin knew, what they couldn't have known, was how those 3 letters had been generated in less than 12 hours. The NAACP letter was straightforward. Bumpy had cultivated a relationship with Thurgood Marshall's office since 1948, when he provided funding for several civil rights cases that Marshall's team couldn't afford to pursue otherwise. The funding was technically anonymous, routed through legitimate businesses Bumpy owned, but Marshall knew the source. When Bumpy's representatives approached the NAACP on the morning of June 4th with a recording of Maxwell's broadcast and a request for official condemnation, Marshall had agreed within 30 minutes. The AFDRA letter was more complex. The union's president, a white liberal named Howard Davis, had no direct connection to Bumpy. But Davis's personal assistant, a black woman named Claudia Morrison, did. Claudia's brother had been one of the policy runners Bumpy employed, and when her brother was killed in a traffic accident in 1950, Bumpy had paid for the funeral and provided Claudia's mother with a monthly stipend. When Claudia received a call on the morning of June 4th suggesting that her boss might want to review recent television broadcasts for racial insensitivity, she presented it as her own observation, backed by her own moral conviction. Davis, who prided himself on progressive values, had immediately convened an emergency meeting of AFTRA's ethics committee. The advertiser letters were the most sophisticated operation. They'd been generated through a coordinated campaign involving multiple pressure points. Colgate-Palmolive's vice president of marketing was a man named Thomas Brighton. He stayed at the Waldorf Astoria whenever he visited New York from the company's Jersey City headquarters. James Russell, the porter who'd spoken about Bumpy's generosity, worked at the Waldorf. On the morning of June 4th, Russell mentioned to Brighton, casually, as if making conversation, that he'd seen a disturbing television broadcast the previous night, something that had upset his wife terribly. He described Maxwell's blackface performance with genuine emotion. Brighton, who was already sensitive about corporate image after several recent scandals, made a note to review the broadcast. But the real pressure came from somewhere else. Brighton's secretary received a phone call at 10:30 a.m. from someone claiming to represent a coalition of Negro consumers who were planning a boycott of Colgate products unless the company withdrew support from programs featuring racist content. The caller was polite, professional, and had specific information about Colgate's advertising budget, market share in black communities, and potential revenue impact of a sustained boycott. The call was a bluff. No such coalition existed, but it was a sophisticated bluff delivered by someone who understood corporate decision-making and spoke the language of business risk. Brighton, already primed by Russell's emotional testimony, decided the risk wasn't worth it. The letter was sent by 2 p.m. General Foods and Chevrolet received similar pressure through different channels. The details varied, but the result was the same. Within 6 hours of Maxwell's broadcast, 3 major advertisers had decided his show was a liability. By 4 p.m. on June 4th, WNYD's executives had made their decision. The Maxwell Hour would be suspended for 2 weeks while the network conducted a comprehensive review of content standards and audience feedback. Maxwell would be paid during the suspension, but he was forbidden from making public statements about the situation. It was a temporary suspension, not a cancellation, but it was the first domino falling the first crack in the structure that supported Maxwell's career. And it had happened so quickly, so smoothly, that Maxwell couldn't even identify who'd initiated the pressure. That evening, at 6:30 p.m., Maxwell sat in his Upper East Side apartment, a spacious two-bedroom that cost $285 per month, affordable on his $52,000 annual salary, and tried to understand what had happened. He'd been controversial before. He'd offended people before. But this was different. This was coordinated, professional, and devastatingly effective. He called his agent, a man named Sidney Rothstein who'd represented him for 7 years. "Sidney, I need you to find out who's behind this. Somebody organized these letters, coordinated the response. I need to know who, and I need to know why." "I'll make some calls," Sidney promised. "But Gerald, I'm going to be honest with you. This might be bigger than you think. The NAACP doesn't get involved unless they think they can make an example of someone. AFTRA doesn't launch ethics investigations frivolously, and advertisers don't pull out simultaneously unless they're facing serious pressure. Whoever did this has reach. In one night, nobody has that kind of reach in one night." Sidney was silent for a moment. "Maybe somebody's been building it for years, and you just gave them a reason to use it." Maxwell dismissed the idea. He was a television host, a minor celebrity in the New York media landscape, who would have been planning his downfall for years. But at that moment, in a social club on 147th Street, Bumpy Johnson was reviewing the day's progress with his strategic counsel and planning the next phase. The suspension was just the beginning. The real destruction